please welcome him. Thank you.
Hey guys. So my name is Ahmed, as I've been introduced. So I've been basically doing dev for just over 8 years. I've been working on backend stuff as well as front-end, but my most recent passion has been Android. And so with this particular talk, I'm going to be touching on Android 10, which is the latest Android that is coming out. In fact, it is being slowly released across different devices, different platforms, and all of that. So they used to call it Android Q. And it was only recently announced that, hey, Google actually has dropped that requirement for using a letter as part of the name. So now it's no longer called Android Q, it's now going to be called Android 10. So hence the Q in the title there, so basically clued up with Android 10. And I'm going to be touching on understanding the privacy requirements that have been introduced or that are going to be introduced in this new version of Android. Okay, so a brief touch on my daily life. Okay, so I always want to keep up to date with all the emails that come through. I've got various emails. I've got my personal email. I've got my work email. And all of this, basically keeping in touch with all this, I use Gmail as an app. I believe most of you might also use Gmail. Some of you probably preferred Inbox when it was there. Rest in peace, Inbox. So Gmail is one of the apps that I use on a daily basis. When it comes to communicating with my loved ones, with my friends, instantly I use WhatsApp, as probably most of you do as well. And then I always want to be able to know exactly where I'm going. Sometimes I even use GPS, sometimes even when I know where I'm going, just in case there might be a faster route or whatever it may be, I use Google Maps. And then when I want to relax, I want to chill, I want to check out, the greatest shows that are currently showing. I use Netflix to basically chill and watch my shows. So you're probably wondering, okay, why did I actually give you this overview of these apps? Well, basically, just like everybody else, we all use smartphones to access these apps. We all use smartphones. And people have created apps on these smartphones for us to be able to carry out our day-to-day business. Okay. Now, which brings me to the premise of this new version of Android that they've released now. So Android 10, right? Over the years, they've actually realized that, you know what? We've added some features within the framework itself, but there are certain features that we feel can be improved on. There are certain features that we feel can actually be more ingrained to make sure that the user has got more control as well as privacy when they're actually being able to do their day-to-day things over the app. So that is the core of Android 10, giving the user more control over their privacy and security. So over the years, these are the privacy features that Android has actually introduced. And obviously, as you can see, it's grown to become a huge platform. And these are features up until Android 9. Okay, so over the years, there's been SE Linux, there's been content-based permissions, guest mode, encrypted backups, lockdown mode, runtime permissions, TLS by default, file-based encryption, Google Play Protect, hardware-protected APIs, secure DNS, application sandboxing, restricted background access to mics, to the microphone, or to the camera, or to the sensor manager. Then they went one step further. So now, like I said, they've now basically made improvements, and with Android 10, this is what they've now introduced. So there's now a permission usage reminder. So basically, it will occasionally tell you that, hey, there's an app that you granted permission. Do you still want it to still have this permission? Okay. Activity recognition permission, app icon handling, mainline, foreground service, more location control, which I'll be touching on, privacy alerts, location reminders, roles, context provider, background app launching, device ID restrictions, location settings, system file picker, permission settings, screen recording, Mac randomization, camera intents, which I'll also be touching on, accessibility usage setting, as well as changes to app storage. Okay. So there are three main reasons that users actually deny permission. And this is based on Google carrying out a survey and asking guys, hey, why is it that you're actually denying these apps permissions? And I'm also one of those people. I'm very hesitant to grant an app all-encompassing permissions. Okay. So the one thing is that the app shouldn't need the permission. How many of you actually feel that way sometimes when you install the app? Yeah. So you install this app and you're like, no, this app shouldn't need to know my telephone or have access to make phone calls. I mean, this is an app that I'm doing tasking or writing notes. So why does it need my phone permission? Okay. So there are users who feel that way. And then users also expect the app to work without that permission. So they're like, no, I'm going to deny it, but this app should still work, irrespective of the fact that I've denied it. Okay? And then the third one is that users feel they can always grant the permission later. Okay. So the question as a developer, so when you actually build the app, okay, you can actually ask yourself, do I really need this permission? This permission that I want to ask the user. Sometimes you have a whole bunch of permissions that you want to put into what is called the Android manifest. You need to ask yourself the question, do I really need this permission? So, for instance, with SMS verification, is there an alternative for SMS verification? Yes, there is. So let's say you want to read the SMS permission for the device. There's an alternative. So you can actually use the Play SMS Retriever API. The Play SMS Retriever API will basically give you, it's not, the scope of it is smaller than having to ask the user for the SMS permission. And this is how you call it. So SMS Retriever client dot start SMS Retriever. And you'll be able to validate the phone via SMS using this Google Play Services method. The second one. Is there an alternative for checking if the user is on a phone call? Okay. So instead of actually calling the read phone state permission, okay, you can actually use the audio focus to see the call state. And the reason being is that while someone is actually on a call, you cannot, as an app, maybe you might want to try and access the audio on the phone. So basically get access to the focus, which is called the audio focus. This is not available during a phone call. So what do? Check if there's a phone call happening. That way you know that the audio is not available. Okay. So this is how you call it: audio manager compact.request audio focus, passing the audio manager and create audio focus request. So there, with the comment they're getting audio focus is not available during a call. Okay. So basically there are alternatives that you need to look into as a developer and say, okay, do I really need to use this permission? If not, maybe there's an API I can use without actually asking the user for an explicit permission to be defined in their manifest. Okay, so you might have realized that, okay, no, in this particular case, I do need the permission. Okay, so here I'll touch on accessing the location permission. Okay, so the key focus on location permission changes within Android 10 is that they basically said, you know what, as a user, you want to be in control of the data you want to share, okay? Because data is important. The whole premise of it, like I said, is privacy and security. So you want to be in control of the location you share to apps when it makes sense. The aim is to provide you with simple, discoverable, easy to understand controls. So when an app actually gives you this request to make to use a permission, you as the user understand exactly what you're about to grant, because your privacy, your control is more important in Android 10. Second one is transparency. Being able to know that, you know what, the apps that are sitting on my device right now, they currently have certain permissions. And use the user being able to revoke the permission at any time. So basically you being able to know outrightly, these are the apps that have access to my permission. So you'll have a situation like this here where you basically define a permission request. So this is how you add the permissions that you're going to need for your app in the manifest file. Okay, so you could either request the course location, okay, which is more a broad location information that it contains, or access find location, which is much more detailed. So you could either have course location or find location. Then in Android 6, Android Marshmallow, they basically introduced this thing called runtime permissions. So the idea behind it is that when a user is performing an action, you can actually request the permission at the point while they're using the app, okay, in runtime. And this is one of the ways you'd actually request the permission. In this case, this is the location permission. So here you're saying, I'd like to use your course location. So is it okay? So use the activity compact, request permissions, this. So passing in the context is this. And then in the array, you can pass an array of permissions that you actually need, although it is recommended that you ask for permissions at a time. At that point, you only want the location permission, so just ask for the location permission. Don't try and ask for any other permissions, okay? And then permission request location is basically, it will be used on your callback. So when you get the result of whether the user has granted your permission or not, then it will fall into that, okay? So once you have defined your permission, where you're saying, I request this permission, on devices that are on Android 9 and below, this is how it'll look like. You've probably seen a dialog like this, where it'll say allow. So I've created an app there called Q-lued up. Okay, so my app Q-lued up, allow Q-lued up to access the device's location. Okay, so this is how it'll look. And you've got two options, deny or allow. Okay, then they have updated this. In Android 10, it'll now look like this. So as you can see, allow Q-lued up to access the device's location. The statement is still the same. However, there's a difference now. Instead of allow deny, it now is saying more. Allow only while using the app. And they've actually defined what this means while an app is actually in use. Okay, so you have an app there, which is Google Maps, that is right in front of you. Okay, you as the user are busy scrolling, you're basically using this. Okay, so that screen there that you see there, that is defined as the foreground activity. That is while in use. Okay, and then there's a separate thing called a foreground service. Okay, so a foreground service would be if you're using Google Maps and then you then say, hey, you start the navigation. So on the previous day, you click on directions and then you click on start, and then the Maps application will now start navigating you, helping you get from place to place. But then you decide to maybe leave the app. Okay, so what Google Maps has done is that they have this thing of a foreground service that basically gives you turn-by-turn directions for the location that you want to go to. So in this case, it's not intrusive at all. It's sitting there as a service. Okay, so there are different service types which require foreground access, and this is very key in Android 10. Okay, so you've got location. So in this case, for Google Maps, it does require the location foreground service type. Otherwise, you will not get access to the location. So if you decide to run a service that requires location, and if you don't define location as a foreground service type, you won't get access to location. We have got connected device, data sync, media playback, media projection, phone call. So for instance, if there's a phone call that's happening, you can actually get that foreground service type defined in your service, and you will get access to when phone calls come in. So services that require foreground access, this is how you define it in your manifest. So when you're defining your service, okay, so you give it whatever name, so name equals, and then that's where the name of the service will go. And then that's the new attribute that has been added to the service as part of Android 10, which is foreground service type. And in there, that's where you'll define the different service types: location, phone call, media playback, and so forth. Okay. Okay, so one other thing as well that they've introduced now is that you will basically have an app that requires access. So if you've been granted access to, let's say, the location, you will have foreground access to that permission, okay? Foreground access, basically while in use access. But if you want a situation where you want to be able to use this permission while in the background, you now have to explicitly define this permission within the app, which is access background location, okay? And this is how you would typically define it. So the idea is you need to always check for permission, for the permission that you require at that point in time. So if you want the user to be able, if you want to be able to navigate the user across a certain route, then you first check, always check, it is very important, always check that you have the permission. Before you execute a function, always check if you have the permission first, because the user has got control to deny the permission at any point in time, okay? So there, the if has foreground location permission, and that basically, that's how it looks, the function there. So I'm checking there, check self permission, which is this, the context. I'm checking if I have the course location, and I'm checking if that's equal to permission granted. Before I do anything else, I need to check if that permission is granted. Then second, I'm then going to check if the background location is granted to me as well. So there, check self permission, manifest permission, access background location, and then also checking if that has also been granted. If it has, then you can then do whatever it is. There you see where it says do something. Else, I'm then going to request the permission. So at the bottom there, request permission, this array of access course background location. So if I don't have the background location, I'm then going to ask for it. So if you don't have it, you can ask for it, okay? And then in the else there, I've checked now that I don't have the location permission. So at the bottom there, here, I then can ask if I need the course location as well as the background location, okay? So once you actually have defined the background location in the manifest, and now that you've actually requested background access to the user's dialog will now look like this, where it says, allow Q-lued to access this device's location. And it'll give you three options. Allow it all the time, allow only while using the app, and deny. So allow only using while the app, that's to do with foreground access. Allow all the time, that allows it to use foreground and background. Okay, so you're basically giving the access to this app all the time. Okay, if you say allow all the time. And then they've basically done a migration strategy within Android 10. So if you've defined your parameters in a certain way, permission will be granted to your app if you fulfill certain criteria. So an app that runs on Android 10 but targets API 28 or lower, so that's Android 9 and lower. So during the installation, if the manifest has the user's permission element for access file location or access course location, automatic user's permission will be granted for access background location. So the system will actually grant you this permission by default, okay? Then the second one, if your app requests app file location or access course location, access background location will be added to your request. So when I was asking at runtime, okay, and if I need access file location or access course location, then the background location will be added to the request. And this is an illustration of the different criteria that you need to fulfill. Okay, so for Android 10, so if your app is targeting Android 10, and you have the course or file permission granted in your manifest, and then you have the background permission as well in your manifest, and then the default permission state will be that you will get both foreground and background access, okay, to location. And then if your app is targeting Android 10, and then the course of final location is granted, and then you do not have the background permission in your manifest, you will only get foreground access. Okay? If you're targeting Android 10, you have course of final permission not granted, background access not in the manifest, it'll be ignored by the system, you will not have access. And then Android 9 or lower, you have course of final permission granted, background permission is in your manifest, it'll be automatically added by the system at device upgrade time. And then the default permission state will now be that you get foreground and background access. And then Android 9 or lower, you do not have course of final permission granted. It's totally ignored by the system. You will not get any permission at all. Okay. One of the changes that they've made to Android 10 is to deal with scoped storage access. And so there were a few issues that were raised, and which is what led to this being implemented. So basically, before Android 10, every app had internal storage. So whenever your app is actually installed on the device, you will basically be sandboxed. It'll be compartmentalized into a section, so you will have your own space on the user's device. But you also get a broad shared storage access when you have the read external storage permission defined. So basically, you have access to your own app as well as everything else defined, which is a security problem. So basically, for a simple picture upload app that needs to maybe upload a profile picture, okay, that's actually too much access. Because you don't want that situation where the app just needs access to an image, but then it has a whole broad access, okay? And then also, I don't know if many of you have actually looked into the apps that are on your devices, especially when you uninstall it, you see these funny files that are there, randomly named, you don't even know whether they're there. Sometimes you're not even sure whether if you delete it, you're going to break your phone, you know? So that's to do with file clutter, okay? So that's one of the things that they realize that, no, we need to actually fix this, okay? So the scope storage principles. So better attribution. So you're not going to have any funny names and all of that. Basically, it's going to be attributed correctly to the app that actually created it. And second thing will be that you will now see transparency about the file creators. You will immediately know that, okay, this file was created by this app that I installed on my phone. And then when the app is uninstalled, those files will be removed. Okay. And then app data protection, because like I said, it's like a compartment that is being created, so the apps have got access to their own information. Okay. So external storage data is not easily accessed by other apps. Okay. So even though your app will have access as well, or its own compartment within the external storage, other apps cannot easily access it. Okay. So the scoped enforcement. Okay. So if you then decide that, you know what, okay, this is too much. I don't want to use scope storage right now. In fact, there was an issue with regards to the testing. So during the beta process, there were users who actually complained and said, we do not want scope storage at all. We do not like it. There's a petition, in fact, I think it's on change.org, requesting that Google rolls back that they don't want scope storage. And so basically Google now introduced this thing called request legacy external storage, which is a flag that you can add and basically say that you want to be able to use the legacy way of accessing external storage. However, there is a caveat to this. You need to make sure that you use scope storage by Android 11. Okay, so by Android 11, this will be the default. You will need to use scope storage. Okay, so to define it in the manifest, you basically add that parameter there, and you will then, so this attribute is false by default on apps targeting Android Q. So this is basically to give developers time to be able to update and start using scope storage, because this is the requirement going forward. Okay, so the scope storage features, app access. So apps, if you have an app, and it gets installed on the user's device. When you create files on the user's device, you've got unrestricted access to that content that you have created with your app, both internal and external. So when you create it on the internal storage place, as well as on the external storage place, your app will have unrestricted access. And then, because of this, the permission is not required for your own content. So read external storage is not required for you to be able to access your own files or your own content that your app has created. Media access, okay? So there's a section called the media store, and you'll be able to contribute to the media store with your own content, basically to read and write. To be able to access other apps' content, if for whatever reason, maybe you want to be able to access another app that has created certain files and all of that, then you will need the read external storage permission. So what they've also realized is that there are certain apps, like for example, file managers and backup and restore apps that might have issues with scope storage. Because I mean, if you create a backup app or a file manager app, you don't want access to your own app. You want the user to be able to have a broad access. Okay, so they've created a system that users can actually submit a proposal to Google, which is a declaration to say, hey, my app actually does A, B, and C. I'd like to be able to have a broad access. Okay, and once you have this broad access, you'll be whitelisted. And then once you're successful, you will then have access to this special permission, which allows you to be able to have this broad access. Okay. So you'll get an unfiltered media store view. So this includes non-media files. And there will be no access to external app directories. This goes back to the security part. Okay. So they don't want you to be able to get access to external app directories. And then if you have a custom file picker of any sort, and then you submit this declaration to Google Play and say, hey, I would like to have this special access, it will not be permitted, unfortunately. You will need to use the system picker if you want to be able to see files instead of your custom. So this is how Android 10's storage mechanism will look like. Okay. Internal app storage, that is not changing at the top there, only accessible to the app. And then you have got the common storage area, which also contains the downloads, as well as the media store location, which is the photo, video, as well as the audio. Okay, so permissions, you do not need any permission to access your own files. Okay, when the app is uninstalled, the files will be removed. To access this, get external files dir. So that's the method you will use to be able to access your own files within the internal storage as well as the common storage. Then, if you want to access the download section, permissions, no. When your app gets uninstalled, the files will stay behind. The recommended way to access this is using the storage access framework. Then the media store, okay? So within this, like I said, you'll be able to contribute to the media store, okay? And your own files, you do not need any permission to be able to access your own files. However, you do need permission to access other apps' files. When your app gets uninstalled, the files stay behind. The recommended access way is the media store. Then, they've also made changes on restrictions on background activities. So, the huge focus of this is an uninterrupted user experience for the user, as well as to give the user more control of what's going on in their apps. So there were situations where you're busy maybe using the Google Maps application, and then suddenly an advert pops up. Okay, while you're busy using, a full screen ad pops up, and basically your experience has now been interrupted, and they are basically wanting to prevent this. So the best practice. So let's say there's a call coming in. Instead of when a call comes in, instead of now displaying a full screen activity to the user, you use what is called a heads up notification. Okay, so the user, like you can see there, is maybe playing a game, and then a high priority notification. So it's a notification using the notification builder. okay, where you can also pass the full screen intent for use full screen intent. This will require you to add it to the Android manifest to be able to get access to the full screen intent to full screen. Okay, and then basically the user now has got two options. They can choose the action to apply, so either ignore or they can choose to answer the call. Their entire experience with the game has not been interrupted at all. They can actually decide that they can ignore it and then they continue with their game, or they can click on answer, which will then lead to a full screen intent. Now you're on the phone call screen, okay, which is the best practice. Okay, so the background activity changes in Android 10. So background into foreground launching has been blocked. Okay, so you can't just launch something from the background and then just throw it at the user. Okay, so it requires a user-initiated action. So the user actually has to click something in order for the full screen to happen. Okay, then this basically maintains the context of the user. So the user, like you saw there with the game, they're busy with the game, so they're not getting interrupted. Also, if the user has got a do not disturb setting on their phone, this is respected by this action. Then they've also made changes to identifiers and data. Okay, so immutable identifiers, which include telephony. So you've got the IMEI, the MEID, ESN, IMSI numbers, and then you've got the build, SIM or USB serial numbers. So the non-resettable device IDs, in Android 10, only system apps have access to the immutable device identifiers. This is to tie with security and protecting the user's data. Okay. To get access to this information, you need to declare Android permission.read privileged phone state. Then the affected methods that require the privileged permission are build.getSerial, telephony manager, .getIMEI, .getDeviceID, .getMEID, get SIM serial number, get subscriber ID. All these methods will be affected. So if you're basically calling these methods in Android 10, you're going to have issues. So without the permission privileged, so that special permission access, apps targeting Android 10 will get a security exception, and then apps targeting Android 9 and below, if the read phone state permission is present, and then you'll get null or a placeholder data, else you will get a security exception. So the best practices. So let's say the purpose of your app or what you want to do there is to do analytics. So for example, you want to do the monthly active users or daily active users. Okay, so the scope of requirement is per app or device user. And then the way that this data will be reset will be if the user chooses clear app data or does a factory reset. And then the API to use there is java-util.uuid to get that information. Then if you want to track cross-app installations, per app, per signature, per device user, and the reset is a factory reset, then settings.secure.android ID is the way to go. And then if you want to use ads, per device user, the reset method is the user action. Then Google Play Services advertising ID is the recommended way to get the identifier. Best practices continued. So you will need to remove all affected APIs relating to non-resettable device IDs. So that telephony one, the build methods, you will need to remove those for Android 10. If the permission is still required up until Android 9, you can, however, add this in. So read privileged phone state, but you will need to add max SDK version 28, because after that, you will then start getting errors. So it will work up until 28. So you as a developer need to ask yourself these questions when you're actually dealing with the user's privacy. Do I really need the data that I'm wanting to collect? Is requiring all the permissions upfront the best? Before the API call, are permissions granted? So like I said, always check, do you have the permission granted to you? Then, if the permission is denied, do you have a fallback as a user? Is your app going to crash? Is your app going to stop working? Is the user experience going to be poor when the user denies the permission? Is the user aware of background processes that your app is basically doing? Then MAC addresses is also getting a change. So basically MAC address randomization, this was introduced as part of Android P, Android Pie, and now it's become the feature within Android 10. So experimental feature, and then now it's a standard. So for Android enterprise users, so if your app is an Android enterprise application, then if you want to obtain the randomized MAC address, so for example, for device owner apps and profile owner apps, retrieve the randomized MAC address assigned to a specific network using get randomized MAC address. And then if you want to obtain the actual factory MAC address, so for device owner apps, retrieve the actual hardware MAC address, use get Wi-Fi MAC address. Wi-Fi is also getting a change. So your app will not be able to enable or disable Wi-Fi in Android 10. Wi-Fi manager.set Wi-Fi enabled will return false. So you're required to use the system panel rather. So as you can see there, the system panel, which is the bottom sheet with that information there. This is the recommended way. You're basically prompting the user to do that action for you. Do not do it for the user. Then non-system or non-device policy controller, DPC apps, which are for Android 10 and plus. So get configured networks will always return empty, an empty list. Network operations such as add network or update network will always return -1. Network operations such as remove network, reassociate, enable network, disable network, reconnect, and disconnect will always return false. So these are functions that return booleans. They will now always return false. And then for resources, you can visit developer.android.com for further information. And then you can also see the Android Developers channel on YouTube. And that is me.